Hello, Symposiast. I'm Dr. Angela Puca, Religious Studies PhD, and as you know, this is your online resource, now live stream, for the academic study of magic, esotericism, paganism, shamanism, and all things occult. As you know, part of my project is bridging the gap between academia and the community of practitioners. And in order to do so, I like to have both academics and practitioners on my channel. And today I have the pleasure of having a practitioner. So we will have a more practitioner oriented type of conversation today. But before I introduce the fantastic guest that we have today, I would like to remind you that Angela Symposium is a crowdfunded project. So this exists thanks to you guys. So if you want to keep this project alive and keep it going, I would really appreciate it if you consider supporting my work with one-off donation. There's PayPal and Coffee, and also there are the monthly memberships that you can get on Patreon. You find all the links in the info box and in a pinned comment, although YouTube is going to take away the clickable links. So rely on the bio because the clickable links will remain there. So thank you all for considering supporting my work, and thanks to all who support it. So let's now bring on our guest. I'm very, very pleased to have you here, Benabell. Benabell Wen. Is Wen the right name of the right way of pronouncing your surname, by the way?
Absolutely. Benebell Wen is perfectly correct. Hi, Dr. Puka. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on the show. I read your book, and I would really recommend people to get it. And you guys will find all the information about Benabell in the info box as well. So don't forget to check it out. So first of all, Benabell, thank you for being here on Angela Symposium. And how are you today?
I'm doing well. Well, very excited to be with you. So I'm doing fantastic, actually.
So apparently you knew of my work.
Who doesn't?
Thank you. I know of your YouTube channel as well. I think it's quite informative for people that want to know about Taoism and tarot and I Ching, of course, which is going to be the topic of today's conversation. And on that note, how would you describe I Ching for to somebody that has no prior knowledge of it? What is I Ching?
I love that you pronounce it correctly. It is I Ching, but I say I Ching because when I speak English, I notice if I say I Ching, I lose some people. I say I Ching, everyone's on board. So I'll just continue saying I Ching, but you are actually saying it correctly. So I love that.
Yeah, we were having a conversation before going live where I was explaining that I come from from a background where I studied Eastern Asian traditions and languages. But yeah, please go on.
Okay. So the I Ching, I would describe it as a sacred text because Jing means sacred text. It's written in a binary code system. So it's written in binary code. That's what the I Ching is. That forms 8 trigrams. And then through, I would say, permutation and calculus being the mathematics of change, it forms 6 line bits of diagrams that we refer to as hexagrams. So the 8 through permutation and calculus becomes 64 hexagrams. And these 64 hexagrams represent a cycle and a circle of change, and also represent the 64 laws or codes and axioms of life. And so we also consider the little text that comes, the text in classical Chinese that gets translated into English that's appended to these 64 hexagrams. That's also now referred to as the I Ching as well. And they're usually poetic verses that read a lot like riddles. So even if you know Chinese as a native speaker, it's really hard to understand. Get 2 people to read the same text, neither 2 will say they fully understand what's happening. But that would be the
Oh, that's interesting. And how was it born historically?
So the legend goes that King Wen was imprisoned by the Emperor of Shang. He was a rebel or revolting group or tribe that then became the Zhou dynasty. But he was imprisoned by the Emperor of Shang, and while imprisoned, he took Fuxi's Bagua, the 8 trigrams, which was created by Fuxi 500 years ago, according to legend. He used the 8 trigrams and then also the Luoshu magic square, which came from Yu the Great, put these together, stacked the trigrams into binary hexagrams, and then from that believed that the 64 hexagrams that he had created was a divination system. And he used this divination system to, as he believed, predict the fall of the Shang dynasty and the rise of the Zhou. And so the 64 hexagrams in the I Ching is also in that way connected to the idea of the mandate of heaven. So the idea is that heaven told him through the I Ching that the mandate of who could rule the people had shifted from one family to another family. So they are interconnected.
Mm. And was he born? So then he was born as a divinatory tool. Then did he have, or does he have any other esoteric applications? We could say.
Oh yeah. So that happened in 1046 BC, right? And so over the next 3,000 years, many different Chinese scholars, many different schools of thought looked at the I Ching and came away with their own perspectives and their own uses for the I Ching. The Duke of Zhou, one of King Wen's sons, he's the one credited with writing the Pythie texts that you see. So next to the 384 lines, there's a little bit of verse that goes with it, and that's credited to the Duke of Zhou, one of the sons of King Wen. King Wen not only created the hexagrams, the Yin and Yang lines, but named the 64 hexagrams. And then later on, 500 years after the Duke of Zhou, came Confucius. And so we credit Confucius as writing out the 10 wings and more of the explication or explaining what these 64 hexagrams are, whether it was actually Confucius who penned it or an army of Confucius scholars over hundreds and hundreds of years, depends on who you speak to, right? Whether you're a practitioner who likes the mythology or you're an academic historian. And so that is kind of where it came from.
Mm. And how did the I Ching became popular, if we can say that it is popular? How did it get known into the Western world or worldwide?
Well, first it became popular through Confucius. Confucius is credited with 5 classics, 5 sacred books. It was the Book of Songs, which is poetry, Book of Documents, which is like poli-sci, political science, and what else was it? Philosophy and rhetoric. And then you have the Book of Rights, which is all about civil procedure and moral codes. And then the Book of Seasons, which is a book on history. And then the 5th book that he said that was important for every scholar to know was the Book of Changes. And so these 5 books throughout the history of the imperial exams in China had to be memorized and also had to be known by anyone who wanted to pass the imperial examinations. So any scholar worth their weight in salt had to know these 5 books, including the Book of Changes. And so that's actually how I got interested in it. And because of that, every single scholar to make themselves stand out, you're going to produce commentary and a lot of your own thesis and dissertations on what these 5 books mean. Book of Changes, the I Ching being one of the more popular ones. So over hundreds and hundreds of years in the multiple dynasties, you have actually many different schools of thought that come out. And one of those schools of thought during the Qing dynasty was the one that the politician in China that what was it? Wilhelm worked with, into first German and then Baines into English. And then I guess because of Carl Jung's fascination with the I Ching and seeing that these Eastern philosophies might explain some of his psychological theories that he couldn't find a rational basis for explaining in the Western constructs, he took a great fascination in the I Ching. And so I guess because of that then became popularized in the East, in the West, as Carl Jung became popularized in the West.
Mm. Yeah, I can imagine so. And what are the differences between the way the I Ching is understood in Asia and in China and how it is understood in Western countries?
Well, one, I think right now, if we're talking about today in the 21st century, the I Ching hasn't been as popular among the lay people. So for example, on a very anecdotal observational level, if I go to Taiwan or I go to mainland China, people just like me, the chances of someone like me being interested in the I Ching is actually very, very low. I think it's kind of the same here in the West, but at least I feel like more people know about it. but then they know about it as a fortune-telling or divinatory system, which it is. The origins of it is divinatory. But I think they have that idea that it's either fortune-telling and therefore more New Agey, or they think that they use the Wilhelm translation, which is filtered through a Christianized lens. And so I think in the East, you're less likely to find a Christianized filter over the I Ching. And so they see it more through the context of a lot of the stories, the legends, and the mythology. The I Ching, a lot of the lines from the I Ching are idioms. It's just that the Chinese people didn't know where those idioms come from. So a lot of the things that we say, like treading on the tail of a tiger or hidden dragon, a lot of these little sayings, or the withering poplar blooms again, so for example, in present day, when you say the withering poplar blooms again, is an idiom for an old woman or a widowed woman marrying a very, very young man. But that idiom came from the I Ching.
And how does the I Ching works in terms of, if you want to use it for divination, how would you use it?
Oh, how do you use it? So the first divinatory approach is basically a form of casting lots, where you're using the yarrow stalks, and there's a whole methodology to it. Even the methodology, if you know the numbers, it follows, you do a lot of division, and then the remainders matter. So it's really interesting how even the concept of the mathematics follows the mathematical formulas that the I Ching itself is based on. So you use yarrow stalks, a counting method, and then a lots casting method to then divine where among the 64 hexagrams, which is seen as a circle, like a cycle, because after 64 it goes back to 1. So where are you located? So it's almost like using a compass to figure out the exact location you are. You find the exact location, you can read around your location to figure out what's happening in your life right now. The yarrow stalk method is considered the more historical one. We believe that was the one that King Wen used because he had the dried yarrow stalks in his prison cell. And so that's sort of where the mythology comes from. I think the exact way that we do it, we can really only credibly say it goes back to 200 BC. So the earliest version of the full divinatory process, step by step, using yarrow stalks, we can only confirm at 200 BC. And then I think around 200 AD is when you have the 3 coin toss method, or a coin toss method, that comes out. And then later on during the Song Dynasty, around the 1100s, Xiaoyong and other different scholars then came up with different approaches. And so, for example, there's rice grains counting that you use, and Xiaoyong used the plum blossom method. So there's actually a lot of different ways to divine with the I Ching. It's not just one.
And which one do you use or advise in your work?
It depends. For me personally, it depends. If you read the Shi Si, which is the text that we rely on for the yarrow stalk method, it talks a lot about the ritual process around divination. So you don't just sit down and willy-nilly do a divination. There's a lot that goes into it. It's a heavily ritualized process. And so if I'm going to the I Ching for something that matters a lot to me, like a matter of extreme importance, I will go through the entire and observe the whole ritualized process, in which case I would use the yarrow stalks. You can also use the rice grains because it's a very tedious method to use the rice grains divinatory method. But if I'm like having fun with friends, or I'm trying to, just like to fun, or, there's a drink in my hand and I'm just having, a light fun, a light flirty fun with it, then I'll use the coin toss method. Or I'll even use even just bibliomancy. I love doing that, where you just, open it to, you just kind of, point to any page at random, point to a line, and then read that, and then find a way to see how that connects to your divinatory question. So there's a lot of ways to approach divination.
Yeah, I can see that. If I was wondering, I guess, how does it differ in your view from other divinatory systems? Because I know that you're also have an interest and look at tarot in your work. So how does it differ, for instance, from the tarot? Not just, obviously, the tarot is very different from the I Ching in the way it works, but I was wondering, is there anything different about what kind of things can you foretell, for instance, with the I Ching compared to tarot, and whether there are other differences that you could highlight?
Okay, one, I think it depends on who you ask. So I personally feel like you can get a lot more specifics, like very tangible, concrete names, like dates, maybe not names because I don't know how to do the English conversion to the Chinese, but for sure, you can get very specific information about timing and location using the I Ching as a divinatory tool. But the reason I believe that is because of my approach to the two divination systems. So when I approach divining with the I Ching, I'm really working with the correspondences because there are so many layers and systems of correspondences built into the I Ching over the centuries and centuries of working with it. And so it's not only the Wuxing five, the five, I guess, movements or five elemental alchemical phases and what those correspondents are, but it's also to the lunar solar calendar, the 60-year sexagenary calendar that we use. It's the fundamental basis of everything in Asia. And so because there are so many correspondence systems, when I do a divinatory reading with it, I also get like a whole database of correspondences that I can look into. I can, you can use it for medical diagnosis, not in a, professional way, right? Not in a medical way, but a lot of times people will use it to figure out what's wrong with their health or with their body because there is that wuxing, five changing phases correspondences to every part of the I Ching. So you can use that to figure out what in your own body is wrong. You can figure out what nutrients you need. And so to me, because of my approach to the I Ching, it's a lot more specific. A lot of times when people read with the tarot, most people, by and large, are going to rely heavily on the narrative imagery of the card itself, especially if they adopt the Rider-Waite-Smith system, right? And so you see a lot less people using Kabbalistic correspondences, astrological correspondences. Those tend to be in the minority of people who use the tarot. And so because it's more of a, like, almost like a psychological projection tool where you're looking at the imagery and seeing what the images inspire from in your mind, that's where you reach some level of truth or divination from the tarot. Whereas I Ching, it feels, at least in my approach, a lot more technical. I don't feel like I can really impose my own biases into it because there's a set established correspondence system. So I can't really read into it.
So do you feel like it's more similar to astrology than it is to tarot?
Absolutely, because astrology is built into the I Ching. So you have, again, like, for example, Bazi, four pillars form of fortune telling, which is a form of astrology in the East. That is very much part and parcel to the I Ching. So it is a lot more like astrology, especially since it's saying that it maps out the heavens, it maps out the earth, and it maps out the underworld. There's that underlying theory or premise of the I Ching. So in that way, it is like astrology where you're reading certain constellations and signs and interpreting it based on a system that you've established.
Yeah, I think that I thought about astrology because when you said you cannot really put too much interpretation into it because it's almost a mathematical system. You didn't say mathematical, but that's what I what I heard basically. So it's something that is technical, and once you have the input and how the output should be interpreted based on what's happening, there isn't a high degree of interpretation that goes into it. And to me, feels like astrology is kind of the same. At least that's how it's been described to me by many practitioners of astrology. So that's how I got reminded of that. I would say that it would be very interesting to expand a bit more on all the correspondences that you mentioned, like the five elements and all the others, what they mean and what they are, because I'm sure that many people might not be familiar with those.
Oh, okay. So there's a lot to it because in terms of the origins of the universe, so I think that's a good place to begin, where you have the Tao. And then,
yeah, let's begin with the origin of the universe. Why not?
No, I don't know where to begin. That's why. So because there's so much to explain. If I start here, then I have to backpedal and explain something.
I'm fine with beginning with the origin.
I'm really confused. Like, I don't know where to start. So there's this idea that you have the Tao, and then the Tao is the entire universe, right? It's everything. So all things is this one. We're all one. However, how do I understand this one? This one is way too difficult for me to understand. There's no way I'll ever understand what the Tao is. So what I do is I subdivide and I cut up into little pieces so I can understand different facets of the Tao. And so like a tangent, this idea of are Asians, or a lot of folk religions, are we pantheistic? Are we monotheistic? Or are we polytheistic? It's a really interesting question that I don't think, if you're coming strictly from an Eastern cultural perspective, we think that deeply about. Do you know what I mean? Because we're all of the above, and we don't always understand, like, we're a little bit, or at least I get confused sometimes, like, why are we making, like, why do you care if you're monotheistic, pantheistic, or poly, like, you're all of the above, right? Like, it's kind of depending on where you are looking at. So if you're looking from up here, of course, you're monotheistic, because at the end of the day, we believe it all goes back to the Tao. But, you know, if you're looking down here to understand my everyday problems, if I have an everyday problem, who am I going to go to? I'm going to look at only one small facet of the Tao. And so then I'm polytheistic. Anyway, so you have the Tao, and then we believe it's subdivided into yin and yang, that the entire universe is created by a binary code system, a lot like computer processing, where everything that we're even seeing on screen right now, the whole entire virtual world, is written through a program of zeros and ones. And so we already have that belief built into the I Ching as well, which predates Taoism. It became absorbed deeply into Taoism, so now we say it's Taoism, but it predates Taoism because it's really the more indigenous beliefs of China that came out of the I Ching. And so you believe in this binary code. And then if you do math and permutations, the binary code, the yin and yang, they subdivide, they create or combine into four, what we call the Si Shang, the four images of God, the four images of the Tao. And if you look at the seasons, like the cycle of seasons and even the cycle of the day, how you track, you know, from night to day, from, you know, spring to winter, we use the four quadrants, four seasons. So the four is that Si Shang. And then those form the trigrams. So when you get the binary plus the four, now you have 8 trigrams. And those 8 trigrams, so I always use the, what is it? The hungry little femme, wise woman must eat is the mnemonic I use. So heaven, lake, fire, the wise woman. So that is thunder, wind, water, mountain, and earth. And so because of those 8 trigrams, they form the Ba Gua. And then there's the Ba Gua is then rearranged to form something called a Luo Shu magic square. And then when you combine the two, that's the reason we combine trigrams into the hexagrams, because you're taking from one arrangement of the trigrams, and then you're taking from the second arrangement, and one represents the exoteric and one represents the esoteric. Now, how did the 4 become the 8? So we believe that there are 5 forces in the universe, 5 forces of change, and so that would be wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. And so they also correspond with the 5 classic books. And so these are the drivers that create everything. So how do you move from yin and yang to the 4 faces, to the trigrams, and to the hexagrams? The driving force that pushes all of this into creation is going to be the 5 changing phases. And then that's kind of where you begin. Now, in terms of what they correspond with, there's so much. So the 5, they correspond with the 5 different tastes. Like I said, the 5 different books. Everything can be explained by the 5 phases. And so it's used in traditional Chinese medicine. It's used in all of our astrological systems and traditions. Even when we talk about we say there's 5 planets, and then there's the sun and the moon, right? So the sacred 7, that's how a lot of the ancients use. So the 5 planets, and then the sun and moon, that is also based on the Wuxing. And then when you look at the days of the week, we also use the Wuxing to describe that. So because of that, every single part of everyday life, the universe, and our concept of the universe is built into the foundational architecture of the I Ching.
So there's a whole cosmology in the I Ching.
Yes, exactly. Which is why it's a book of philosophy too. I think that's what we often miss. It's not just divination, it's a book of philosophy. It explains that the world, history always repeats itself. And so that's the reason it works as divination. The reason it works as divination isn't something like magical, mystical, and mysterious, although it is all of that. The logic behind divination is that everyone repeats itself, that we're sort of fated to repeat. And so you can figure out where you are located. If you know where you're located, it'll tell you what's going to happen next. And so that's why it feels like it predicts the future. But it's more about just knowing the cycles of change. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I think that's a great point to make. So is that how the time is perceived? Because that makes me think, makes me wonder how time is perceived. I think there's a long standing debate in the esoteric communities about how uh, divination works in terms of, and I think it has to do a lot with the concept of time. And I find it interesting. I think an interesting argument when it comes to divination and how does it work is the idea that time is a human construct, really. So we need time in order to understand what's going on. So even a movement or a set of words, if you don't put them in the order of before, in between and after, or past, present, and future, you're not even able to compute them because we are not built that way. We are built with inner filters and inner categories, as Immanuel Kant used to say. And the most the primary ones, according to Immanuel Kant, were space and time. So I think that also enters the debate about whether divination interferes with the free will or not. And I know that there are many different views in the esoteric communities about that, because some people say when you are doing divination, it's just the path that it's ahead of you if you keep doing the things that you do now, but it's not set in stone. And then there's and that's usually called more divination. And then the fortune telling tends to lean more towards the idea of, no, this is going to happen, there's no way around it. So there are two different views about divination, and for some people certain tools would lead more to the divination, the one that you can change, or at least to a degree you can change, and the fortune telling that is more about, this is going to happen, and whatever you do, that's going to happen. So I was wondering with the I Ching, which one it is, if any.
Well, so because it's built with the stacking of two different arrangements of trigrams, the two bakwa, you have an early heaven Fuxi bakwa, which is associated with the very first early form of the 8 trigram arrangement. And then you have the King Wen bakwa, the later heaven bakwa. So the idea is that one of the series, one cycle of 8, represents the natural order. If left to its own devices, this is the unfolding path of the universe. And then the second is the occult or esoteric arrangement, which means now that I know the rules and the axioms of how the unfolding path progresses, I can actually manipulate using, like, I want to make sure manipulate is implied in a neutral way. It's not meant to be a negative, but just there's things that the human can do to exert their will and purpose over the flow of chi and the life force in the universe to then modify that path and change the path. And another reason we talk about the I Ching as a circle is because it is not only the wheel that keeps on going where you know exactly what the next step is, but it's also about understanding and manipulating space. So you can stand at different positions of that circle, for example, the epicenter. So if you stand at the center, then you can actually change the different radiuses. And so in that sense, we're not necessarily fatalist. We are only fatalist to the extent that, for the most part, most humans don't possess the power and will and purpose to modify the unfolding path of the universe in its natural course. However, you can train and cultivate enough power to be able to modify the course of the universe. So it's actually both. It's this idea of step one, rule number one is it's really hard to change. This is the path. This is how it works. You can fortune tell or divine exactly what will happen next because, you're weak and there's nothing you can do about it. Or you can now learn what the path is and cultivate enough personal power to then modify and change that. So in that way, it's very like based on free will and also very optimistic because you can pretty much change anything so long as you cultivate the power to do so.
And how do you cultivate the power to do so?
Depends on who you ask, I suppose. Simple ones, Qigong, I always say, forms of amplifying the power of your chi. And so like a very like sort of a martial arts example, right? So because I haven't been trained in martial arts, if I punch something, it's not even about my muscles, but I can't, consolidate my personal chi in a way that can punch someone that hurts. But somebody who has the exact body type as me, complete everything exactly the same, but who trains in martial arts, their punch will be 10 times more powerful than mine because they know how to consolidate their chi. So that's kind of how you do it, like little ways of figuring out how to amplify, concentrate, and consolidate your life force, your focus. In a very mundane psychological way of saying it is how do you focus, how to prioritize, and how to focus your energies and intentions. Is a very simple, easy, mundane way of looking at that.
Mm. And in terms of the practice to actually achieve this enhancement in your chi punching.
I should not have used that example. That was a bad example.
Well, we're gonna stick with it now. I'm kidding. But yeah, are there any exercises that are usually done by people that practice I Ching, or indeed yourself, to enhance how you can manipulate the I Ching so that you can affect your destiny and even alter the things that have been predicted in a divination?
That's the $1 million question, because there are so many different schools of thought, and it's over the years has been influenced by Confucianism, the Taoism, and even Buddhism. So I'm trying to make sure that I'm very clear on what came from what. So I guess in terms of esoteric Taoist practice, one of the things that people do, and it's not just about making sure your divinatory practice is more accurate and more powerful, but just even in terms of how you can exert your will in a very productive way over the forces of nature, is to look at the 8 trigrams. They personify them as the 8 immortals, or 8, some form of divine being that's been personified through the 8 trigrams. And then you invoke the 8 spirit beings, 8 ascended masters, 8, however you want to characterize or personify the trigrams. Cultivate a close working relationship with those 8, and through that you'll dial into their pillar or channel of power, and you'll be able to siphon directly from their pillar of powers. So then you can choose to use thunder, or you can choose to use earth, or choose to use water. So that's one kind of more concrete step-by-step way. There are also schools of thought that believe in karmic cultivation. So it sounds kind of cheesy when you put it in English, but they're called schools of beneficence, where doing good, being compassionate, like literally just being a good person, will cultivate your chi and make you a stronger person and be able to control nature if you are just a better person.
Does it mean that nature is inherently good then?
I think well, here's the thing. Good is an opinion, like what is good, what is evil,
Exactly.
what benefits me is what I call good, and what does not benefit me is what I call evil. And so it's completely subjective. I think those who are practicing the Tao, they are not always going to see something destructive as evil, or something dark as because destruction, even if it's destroying, your city, or destroying something that you care deeply about, there's a greater good that maybe we don't understand, or we are not able to grasp, because I'm so self-involved, I'm navel gazing, and it was really, really evil and bad for me. I can't see how it was better for a greater good, that it lays the foundation for something greater to come. So there's no good and evil. It's just the cycles of change. It's just creation and destruction over and over again. And sometimes, creation or destruction is bad for me. Sometimes it's good for me. But that is my own vantage point. The only more objective vantage point would be creation and destruction. And then the 5, how it's done, creation and destruction through transformation, through segregation, dissemination, and those are the 5 changing phases. So it's objective.
Yeah, that actually, I really like that, and I think that it mirrors my way of looking at good and bad, at least from a cosmological point of view. Because from a societal point of view, then it could be different, and it's definitely different for me. But when you look at the great picture of the universe, it's like, what is, when you remove what is beneficial or what is harmful to people, at the greater level, how do you define good and bad? And obviously, I don't think that there is good and bad from a universal point of view. I think that it's a cycle of creation and destruction. So, and sometimes I also feel like what we tend to call good is more in line with the creative power, with the creative force in the universe, and what we call as evil is more in line with the destructive force in the universe. Because, for instance, when you cause harm, it is a destruction of something, and when you are helping somebody, it is aiding something creative. It is adding, it's a plus, it's not a minus to a person. Whereas harm is more of a minus, at least in the way I see things in my head. So I like that.
To defend I mean, it's more of a Buddhist perspective, but to defend those schools of beneficence, I think like where that's coming from, it's not good. Like, it's a different definition of good. The idea is that if you cultivate beneficence, you cultivate compassion and selflessness. And so then eventually your perspective is broader and it's not so much navel gazing anymore. So you are actually, in fact, if you cultivate good by this school of thought, you're able to be more selfless and to let go of the biases of the self. And therefore, you can see creation and destruction on a more macroscopic vantage point. Therefore, you're more detached from your own personal pain and suffering, and you're able to see what is good in terms of, how the flow of qi. And so I think that's why they say this, the practice of good is going to cultivate stronger power.
I agree with Edward. Chocolate is good objectively. Yeah.
I agree 1,000%. My sister hates chocolate, though. I have a sister.
Oh.
I don't understand. I think that's very bad. How can you hate chocolate? But yeah, I have a sister who doesn't like chocolate at all, which is good for me because I always get more chocolate.
Yeah, it would be fine by me as well. I eat a healthy chocolate-based diet. So
Absolutely.
But I was wondering if you could, by the way, thank you to Andrew, Joao, and Edward for moderating the chat. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on those forces in the universe, the 5 forces. And then I guess, because I have a million questions every time that you speak, it's like I have a million questions. Like, I also noticed the fact that there are a few numbers that recur, right? Not just one, but the 5 seems to be quite a recurring number. So I was wondering about that as well. But yeah, let's start with the forces. Could you elaborate a bit more on the forces that are found in the universe?
Yeah, everything is either 5s or 12s, the 60s and 64s. And then even when you do the division into the remainders, 8s as well. It's a whole thing. Like, it's really interesting. The more you learn about the various aspects to the I Ching and the Tao, they all connect. They all kind of align at the end of the day. Everything aligns and reconciles with each other at the end of the day, which I think is why it's a system that just provides endless fascination. So fire, we'll begin with wood. So wood is rising energy, it's growth, right? And then you have fire. Fire is expansion. So after energy rises, not creates, but it rises in some way. That's the wood energy. So a great way to think of that is the seed that grows into that little green sapling. And then fire is expansion. So fire is about attracting more. So for example, I attract more to make myself bigger, and then I expand out and I can progress. So fire is usually associated with progress, philosophy, logic, what else? Like illumination, any form of illumination, metaphysically, figuratively, and literally is associated with fire. Then you have earth. Earth is transforming energy. An idea of that is the womb. So something in the womb, the energy is transforming. So even if you see the earth under the ground as, as a womb of some sort, that is that transforming energy. And then you have metal. Metal is minerals, right? And so it's under the ground. What forms in the earth is the minerals. And also there's this idea that the stellar energy, the heavens, is also metal. And so stellar matter that comes down and hits the ground and is buried into the ground is also the metal. And then you have water. Water is associated with mysteries because there's this idea of the future is uncertain, is scary, is it's like woo. And so water is always associated with intuition, psychic ability, mediumship, death, the afterlife, and all of that. So that's the cycle of changes that goes through and through. And then this cycle of changes, as it moves from one phase to the other, it creates the 8 trigrams. And then the 8 trigrams, it's 2, 1, 2, 1, where you have fire and water that only have 1 trigram correspondence, and then the other 3 have 2 trigram correspondences. And so the fire and water also, even though there's 2, again, the mathematics, because the 5 works into it. So the 5 is the planets that go across for the Wuxing, right? Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, Venus, etc., and Saturn. And then the 2 not only correspond with 2 of those 5 planets, but that's where you find the sun and the moon. So the sacred 7 also kind of divide into, with remainders, into the Wuxing.
That's very interesting. And what about the Yin and Yang symbol, which is quite popular in the West as well? Could you elaborate more on that and the significance that it has?
Yin we often associate with destructive energy. It's dark, like in the most simplest term, it's dark. Yang is light. And so anytime you have something that does not, that absorbs light and takes it in, then that's the dark, that's the yin. Anything that emits light, that pulls it out, that radiates with light, that's going to be the yang. And so you have sort of these 2 forces like that. And then we use that as a metaphor to explain everything else. Creative and destructive, protons and neutrons, et cetera, et cetera. And so it depends on who you ask. I think it's more of a categorical system. You see it as a truth, like, okay, this is the way, the yin and the yang. This is the fundamental core definition of yin and the core definition of yang. And then you go out into this world and start categorizing what is what. Same with the Wuxing, the 5 changing phases. You know that this is the core definition of the 5. So you go out into the world to see what is what. And you're going to have differences of opinion because you have 3,000 years of scholarship. So you ask 10 different scholars what corresponds with one, especially when you get into traditional Chinese medicine practitioners, you are going to see some differences of opinion.
Yes. And what about the association between the yang to the masculine and the yin as the feminine?
So I've heard a lot of Asians say that came from the West. But in the research that I had to do for my book, that's not true. I've seen a lot of books, texts from the Taoist canons. They'll show yin, and then they'll have like a drawing of a woman, and then they'll show yang, they'll have a drawing of a man. And so I see it as just the evolution of human thought. I think it's really, really easy when you look at how masculine presenting and feminine presenting, especially when you apply cultural norms to it, it's easy to categorize the culturally socialized woman as yin and the culturally socialized man or masculine energy as yang. Like, it's really easy to do that. But I think anybody who's going to dig deeper into the philosophy of it, it's closer to the idea of anima and animus, where we each have both inside of us, and which is why you have the Tai Chi too, which is that yin and yang symbol. It's that idea of that you do have both within you. Everybody has both, and it has nothing to do with your gender or sexual identification. It has a lot more to do with your own personality and how you navigate this world, whether or not yang is more dominant or yin is more dominant. And often, however, because of the way we're socialized, those who are yang dominant tend to exhibit what we call masculine traits. Even someone who looks very femme, if they're yang dominant in terms of physical disposition and in traditional Chinese medicine, again, using stereotypes, they tend to be louder, they're more aggressive, they're more ambitious. Even like we even have these ideas, right? And then yin, even a man who is more yin dominant, they're going to be more pensive, quieter, more reactive than proactive. So we still have these socialized constructs, but it's one way of navigating this world.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Hank, for the chocolate bar. But yeah, I understand what you mean. And I think that there have been many association to the feminine and the masculine in that respect, even in contemporary paganism. And I think they kind of boil down to the idea of the projective and the receptive. And it's not really, I wouldn't see that as strictly connected to the idea that we have of biological sex or indeed gender.
I don't think so either. And I don't think the I Ching or that the cosmological principles did either. I think it's just how we, over the centuries, how we've socialized ourselves. Like I said, because what we're doing is we're observing the world and then categorizing what we see into the different categories, the different labels. And this is how we've categorized the labels, but it doesn't mean it's not subject to change or evolution of thought.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And so another thing that came to mind while you were speaking is that the I Ching doesn't seem to be related to one religion, but it seems to be a bit transversal. So do you think that it has, well, because it has a specific cosmology, right? It's built on a specific cosmology. So do you think that it is compatible with certain religions only? And which ones would they be? Or do you think that it's particularly connected to one religion as opposed to another? Or it's been more influenced by one religion as opposed to another? So my question is a broad question about how I Ching relates to religions.
Well, a bunch of Jesuit missionaries from the 1700s and 1800s learned about the I Ching and believed it was proof of God. So they saw it as proof positive of Christian ideologies. Where obviously there's no direct historical connection, but these times, like, the point is, no matter who you are or where you come from, the I Ching is like a mirror. It reflects back who you are, but then leads you to higher ground. It helps you to evolve and change. So it meets you where you are, and then it will show you more so that you can further develop and deepen your understanding of the world by starting with your own point of view. And you see that both in terms of not just religion, but also politics, because the I Ching was often used throughout history for statecraft and geopolitics. So you see, for example, Japanese scholars believing the I Ching proves that you need to be more nationalistic and authoritarian, and it believed in a conservative, it exuded the conservative values of traditionalism. But then during the Cultural Revolution, Chairman Mao cited the I Ching as proof positive that we need a revolution. And so whether you are more leftist or rightist, you will see yourself reflected in the tenets of the I Ching. And then Buddhism, of course, very clearly over the centuries saw a lot of Buddhist tenets, and even a lot of the interpretations and commentaries on the I Ching that you see in Chinese. It is heavily influenced by Buddhism. So if you are a scholar or an academic of the I Ching in Asia, one of the things you do have to do is kind of dismantle what is coming from Confucianism, what is coming from Buddhism, and what is a little bit more truer to what it was before the influences of those different religious tenets, right? And so a lot of times it just depends on what time period you're looking at, the commentaries of the I Ching and what will be influencing it. Taoism, of course, as well. A lot of the I Ching is what formed what became the institutionalized tradition and religion of Taoism.
Hmm. So if I'm understanding it correctly, across different periods in time, the I Ching has had different influences, different religious influences. The most prevalent one was from Taoism. However, as a device, as a divination device, is not necessarily connected to any religion.
That's correct.
That's correct? Okay.
I would say, if anything, it's even Chinese historians talk about this when I was doing the research for the book. They say it's shamanistic historical origins. So the indigenous shamanistic practices that King Wen, the king of Shang dynasty, like, that is where it would be rooted. If you had to connect it to a religion, it would be that, the indigenous shamanistic folk practices. And then actually it's Taoism and Confucianism. So a lot of how because Confucius is credited as authoring 50% of the I Ching, because of that, it's also heavily influenced by Confucianist thought.
Yes, of course. And since we briefly mentioned earlier Jung and his influence on popularizing, or at least bringing the I Ching into the Western world, could you elaborate a bit more on what Jung said about the I Ching and his interpretation and his works around it?
I think he's most famous for believing that the I Ching explains his theory of synchronicity, where something happens, like it's almost like acupuncture. I always use the metaphor of acupuncture, where one point here actually corresponds with something happening somewhere else, but they happen at the same time. So if you see one, then you can understand the other, and that's the divination, or that's the concept of divination. So he believed that synchronicity, or acausal synchronicity, was explained by the reason that the I Ching was an effective tool. I think it's interesting also that lesser known, but is definitely there in the foreword. If you read it to the Wilhelm version of the I Ching, he does say some things that I don't think have aged as well over the years, which is he didn't believe that the Chinese understood science. So he's like, oh, this is a civilization that doesn't understand math or science, but they have this really cool tool, the I Ching. So wow, how do they come up with this? I guess it's because they don't really understand science. They're not, restricted to the rigors of the scientific method the way we are. So they are able to come up with these more wackadoodle ideas. But by coming up with wackadoodle ideas, they hit on a truth. A wrong clock is right twice a day or something like that kind of idea. So he did kind of say something like that. It didn't age as well. I think it's also interesting that he was very clear that the I Ching is not a cult and it's not esoteric. He was like, oh, this is just philosophy. It's proof of God almost. But, I don't think he saw it as something that was a cult. But then, people like Crowley took that idea from Jung and ran with it into the occult spaces. So it is funny that even though he said the I Ching's not a cult, his work, or him popularizing the I Ching, is what caused the I Ching to then become popular in Western occult circles. Just fun irony.
Yeah. Well, I think it was very common at the time of Jung to have that exoticizing view over the non-Western countries, basically. So there was this idea. I think that I've talked about that with other scholars that have been on the channel before as well. The idea that at the same time you are exoticizing certain cultures and certain countries, considering them backwardly and not as advanced as Western countries, but that exoticization brings about a sense of mystery and a sense of irrational. And so it's like, yeah, they are the irrational, but when you want to learn about irrationality, that is the place to go. And that's how you elevate, in a way, certain cultures to the realm of the spiritual ones, which to may seem to a degree to be a way of revaluating them, but it's only revaluating them in a specific lens and within a certain narrative where the Western countries are still the protagonists of the story and saying, you know, we are the advanced, intellectual, rational, civilized. They are the uncivilized and irrational, but look at them playing with those things. It's like when we want to learn things about the irrational side, then we have to go there. So it's a bit problematic, and it's something that you find quite often in the 19th century and in the 20th century. It's something that is quite prevalent. This idea of elevating Asian countries, especially even with India, you see that elevating those countries, and then with the indigenous people, that happens as well, elevating them to those who have all the secrets of the universe because they are the irrational, whereas because they survive the civilization and the rational way of looking at things that we have adopted. So it's problematic in that sense because it doesn't really it makes certain cultures and certain people into a character, into a stereotype, not seeing the full picture.
I think it's also human nature, because if you look at Chinese history for a long time, especially when they were during their own Enlightenment and Renaissance periods, and they were flourishing during their own golden age, we called ourselves the Middle Kingdom because we believed nobody else had anything to offer us. And then I think in, was it 500 BC, or what the reason Buddhism became so popular in China is because it was this idea of an imported exotic idea. And there was, again, that exotification of an imported idea, but then it just took root. And so I think it's part of human nature as well to center ourselves, obviously, and then to see something that makes sense to us, but we didn't come up with it as exotic and cool and wanting to take that and integrate it into our life. That's just human nature, I think.
Yeah, and there's a long-standing, well, not debate, because actually scholars agree on that. The fact that terms like magic and witchcraft are terms of othering. So when something belongs to my religion, then it's religious. When it's something that somebody from a different religion does, then it's witchcraft and it's magic. So
Mhm.
it's a term of othering. So I think that this association between this equation almost between something that is other, exotic, other, and mystical witchcraft, occult, I think that there is a little bit of that equation that has happened through history.
That is a big part of how I had to wrap my mind around how even Taoist mysticism is characterized or perceived. So for me, growing up the whole time, I never really saw what I did as the occult or esoteric or magic or witchcraft. It was, I don't even know what it was. It was just, it was so mundane and boring that I didn't even care about it. In fact, I was interested in Western occultism because that was exotic to me when I was first here in the United States. And then when people talk about Taoist magic as being, oh, that's occult, that's so cool, it took a minute for me to wrap my mind around, oh, so this thing that I think is mundane and boring and not interesting, you think of this as occult and witchcraft. Oh, very cool. So it is interesting to see the differing perspectives.
Yeah, and it happens also, and sometimes certain occult systems within their own cultural context can be seen as superstitious as well.
Yeah.
So when you don't have magic and witchcraft as terms of othering, you have superstition as a term of setting aside parts of your own culture that are not exotic, but they are not accepted.
That's absolutely
Um, because I can see that with Italian witchcraft that I studied for my PhD, where people that started to value those folk magic practices were people that moved from one place to another, where it was not that embedded in the local place, because otherwise they were seen as backwardly superstitious practices that, who believes in that? Um, but yeah, that's quite interesting. So, how did Jung use the I Ching then? What did he find valuable about it?
I didn't study Jung too in depth. I think just reading his writings on the I Ching is the only way I can glean any conclusion. So I don't know, but it's interesting how it looked like he was using it for divination, but then he said this is not divination, so I'm confused, but so he seems to be using it the same way that we would use it and then call divination in the East. And then he says, so I'm going to do this, but this is not divination. This is like philosophy and psychology. I'm like, okay, fair enough. So I think maybe it's just a difference of vocabulary sets, right? I think everyone's talking about the same thing, but we're using sets of vocabulary that we are comfortable with. So when he says what he's doing is just almost like a projection, or he's using it so that he can deeper into his unconscious, like the things that he's pulling out when he's using the I Ching, it triggers recollection of aspects of memory that he couldn't remember, or it allows something from packets of data from the unconscious to surface into the conscious mind so he can become self-aware of it. So that's how he used it. But then you ask somebody from China, like, oh, that's fortune telling. It's just differences in vocabulary.
Mm. Yeah, I was just talking with my patrons about that, which is an interesting synchronicity if we want to use the Jungian terminology, because I have a monthly call with all my patrons, and we were discussing the importance of terminology and definition. And one thing that I was pointing out in that conversation is that people define things for very personal reasons, and that's why there was a conversation about whether terms even matter, and also how, for instance, academics treat terms and how practitioners treat terms. And it's very different because academics look at how many people, a myriad different uses have been done of the term, and what emerges from that. Whereas individual people tend to define things one way or another depending on many personal reasons. So it could be that Jung wanted to label the I Ching in a certain way because it was convenient to him, because it was not acceptable to call it occult or to call it divination in the circle that he had as his audience of his books at the time. So I think there are very often personal reasons as to why people use certain definitions and certain labels, and that's why I find so valuable the academic perspective as well. I mean, not that the individual practitioner's perspective is not important, because of course it is, but we need to bear in mind that that has also very personal reasons behind why you say one thing as opposed to another.
Yeah.
Whereas the academic perspective tends to look at the thing from a broader perspective and try and understand what the term actually means, as opposed to what individual people will define it as, depending on their circumstances and the potential benefits or downsides.
It's very much a double-edged sword. I think it's absolutely necessary on the academic level to have those definitions. And then the thing with that, though, is I think sometimes there's a disconnect between how it's used, boots on the ground, in terms of the actual practitioners that the academics are studying. There's a huge difference in how they're using the words to describe and articulate the same exact thing. And so I think, I don't know how to fix that. But I do see that a lot, even in terms of how, various aspects of Taoism, Taoist philosophy versus Taoist mysticism, and religion in Asia, whether Confucianism, is that philosophy or religion? Like, you have a lot of these, what is shamanism in Asia? Like, there are a lot of these conversations that I think it's really hard to get everybody on the same page, because like you just said, like, everyone is beginning with a very different set of definitions. And so I don't know how to reconcile that, but that's just a really interesting observation.
Yeah, that's a problem for us. Well, I do have my solution to reconcile that, but I don't want to get into methodology too much, and since people may be here to learn about the I Ching, but I can say briefly that I've talked in other videos about the methodology that is quite popular now in religious studies, and that's discourse analysis. Is a Foucauldian methodology where you identify patterns of meaning that emerge in the community. So it's not about what the individual person says, but when you give numerous people. So that's one thing that you find in social science, that there are apparent differences among different individuals, and those differences tend to subside when you look at at a bigger scale. So you will find that when you have enough definitions from the practicing community, there are patterns of meaning that are quite consistent. So obviously there's also another way of defining, which is more an up-down way of defining, saying, oh, this is the meaning, and if you're not using the term, that is not correct. But it's not the approach that we have in religious studies nowadays, because we do value what people think. So that's a 19th century, early 20th century approach that is outdated now. But it is interesting how you can find actually consistency when you look at what people say at a bigger, at a greater scale, especially when you don't just allow them to define, but also to explain why did you define it that way. When you have those two information and you have enough data, you tend to find that there is actually some consistency, enough consistency for you to determine a definition. That's the methodology that I use to define shamanism in my PhD.
As you were explaining that, I was wondering about, for example, yin and yang, right? And so I think there's a plurality of opinions, even within certain cultures, like even within certain homogenous cultures and homogenous traditions. There is a plurality of opinion on whether or not yin is attributed to feminine and yang is attributed to masculine. I have my firm opinions, but then if I'm trying to be unbiased, I can't discount the idea that yin is feminine and yang is masculine, because that's a really strong and popular perspective. So I can't say that's wrong. You see what I'm saying? So like, how would you reconcile that where you have a very robust and strong opinion on two sides that are in direct contradiction with each other from the same exact culture?
I think that sometimes contradictions are not as contradictory as they may seem at first. So I think that you reconcile that by qualifying further. So it's like when you say this is feminine and this is masculine, what do you mean exactly? And when you ask these questions, you will find that things are perhaps not as contradictory as they may seem at first. At least that's my experience. It's just that I think that human beings tend to summarize things. I think that the problem with labels is that they are extremely concise, and so you just have to pick one thing, and that's the what is the clearest for you. But then when you ask people to elaborate and to qualify further, then you will find that actually there are many more liaison points, more than you would have anticipated. So that would be my prediction. But if you try that, let me know if that works.
That's a
But
great, I love that. And it also shows the importance and value of discourse. So I really love that.
yeah, I think that one thing that we generally need more as a society, and it's a great part of the academic world, but I think that the general public would benefit from that is the value of complexity and nuance. So it's not just about a yes and no, is this or is this that? It's more about the complexity, the nuance. What is the reasoning behind associating these two things? What is the reasoning for you? When you allow people to elaborate on things, you will find that there's much more than image, and sometimes, quite often, actually, I think that there are fewer contradictions that you would think, and probably they would also apply to people that have different political views. Not always, because sometimes it's just irreconcilable. But with people that are a bit more moderate, you will find that certain reasoning behind things may underlie similar needs that tend to be expressed in ways that appear different.
Yeah. And then understanding a person's why and how causes you to empathize with them. And then when you empathize with them, it's a little bit harder to dismiss their values and their importance. Whereas if you use labels, it's very easy for me to say, oh, you are this label, I am that label. We're obviously different, end of discussion. So yeah, the discourse is the why and the how is very important.
Yeah, I think that's true. The complexity is always something that I advocate for.
That's how I
So
approach occultism too. Even the correspondences, it's always, for me, it's not about how you interpret the lines of for example, if you do a divination and you see a verse in the I Ching, how you interpret that and apply it to everyday life and translate that to something that is coherent to everyday life. I think it's not the end result that matters as much as the why and the how, to understand how that translator or interpreter or diviner arrived at that conclusion. I think that is the value.
mm. Are there certain questions that the aging cannot answer, or can it be used to answer any type of question?
I think the most common sentiment is that it can answer any question whatsoever. However, what is the value of asking certain questions? And knowing certain things, is it going to be helpful to you or is it going to be detrimental to you? And so there is wisdom in knowing what questions to present to the I Ching, but it doesn't mean that there are only certain questions the I Ching will answer. So the principle is that I can bring any question whatsoever. There's infinite amounts of topics that the I Ching can answer because it represents all of truth, the universe of truth, and the cycles of truth. But then, is it wise for me to ask certain questions?
Mhm. Yeah, that's something that I've heard from tarot readers that I know as well. That it's also, there's also that element. And I guess a question that I'd like to ask you is, what is your favorite experience with the I Ching?
Oh,
If you don't mind sharing.
I would say my favorite experience is when my grandmother passed on. And so I wrote about this in, I think, the introduction or the foreword. I had never thought of the I Ching as being used as a tool for mediumship at all. The culture that I grew up in, it's just not something that had crossed my mind at the age that I was when my maternal grandmother had passed on. But I was in college. I wasn't allowed to go back to Taiwan to attend her funeral or any of that. So I just disconnected from her, and there was no way for me to be able to grieve over that. And so I used the I Ching. Like, I don't know what, it was just intuition. You're just motivated by something within. So I decided to try to communicate with her through the I Ching. And so, at least according to my perspective, I believe that I did. I went through, because you wanted to do something, you go through all of the ritual, all of the ceremony, the pomp and circumstance. I'm going to make this happen. And so I did all the things that you're supposed to do to contact the dead if you're using the I Ching. And so that was, and I believe that was my way of, kind of having closure with the fact that I couldn't attend my grandmother's funeral and I couldn't be there to grieve her.
Oh, that's lovely.
So that's obviously the most memorable one.
And what would people find in your book?
So half of it is the cultural and historical context for the I Ching, so that you can approach practice of the I Ching from a very informed perspective. So I really wanted to show that there's no right or wrong. There's just a diversity of schools and systems of thought over the centuries, over the dynasties. And I tried my best to kind of cover, in cliff notes, nuts and bolts, brief summaries of the various schools of thought and approaches to the I Ching over the dynasties. So you have that. And then you have, why do we say this is a shamanistic historical origin? Like, why do we say the I Ching is shamanistic in its origin? And so I talk about that as well. I also talk about the everyday folk practice, how it is actually used. If you go to Vietnam, if you go to Thailand, if you go to the Philippines, you go to Taiwan, you go to Hong Kong, you go to various parts of China, and it matters whether it's the north or the south. That's a huge difference. So depending on which region you go to in China, what will you see? What are the practices of I Ching you're going to see? And then the other half is the actual classical translations from the classical Chinese into English. And the way I approach translation was, I have the part where it's more literal. So it's more of a literal translation, so that you can still be like, the blooming poplar, rather than telling you what to think. I kind of try my best to maintain the original text of it. And then underneath it, there's a commentary. Well, this scholar believes it means this. That scholar over here means this. I think it means that. And then I also talk about some of the legends. A lot of the lines, they harken back to a lot of mythology and a lot of legends that your average Chinese person, especially earlier on in history, they're going to know these legends. So when they see this, they know exactly what it's referencing. They know it's referencing this historical figure, this legendary figure, this and that. And so I try to give you that so you can see the legends behind each of the lines.
Yeah, that sounds super interesting. So I definitely recommend people to get your book. So is there anything that you want to add before we wrap up about the I Ching that you feel people should know about it?
I think it's for everyone. I think that's kind of what it has always been. I find that if you even look at its own history, it always course corrects. So even though certain schools of thought on how to interpret the I Ching or the commentary around the I Ching will dominate during very short temporary periods of time in human history. But there's like an independent sentience to the book that I intuit from it, that it will course correct and always swing back to a different, where it needs to go in terms of what will be a dominating school of thought. And so because I have that faith in it, I really hope that people are brave enough to interpret it the way they want to interpret it, and then to put that idea out into the marketplace of ideas, because all you are doing is contributing to the diversity of thought around the I Ching. And I think a lot of people today don't feel the self-confidence to do that. And I hope that this book will inspire people to be more confident in imposing their own perspectives and worldviews onto the Book of Changes.
That's great. Thank you so much, Benebell, and thank you for being here on the show on Angela Symposium.
Thank you so much. I had a lot of fun.
And where can people find you, by the way, before we wrap up?
Benebellwen.com is the website. I'm also here on YouTube, but I create a lot of like junk stuff. Just whatever I
It's
feel.
not junk stuff.
There's no rhyme or reason. There's no like cohesive plan. It's whatever I feel like doing that week, or not. I'll go like months without posting anything. But YouTube and my website are good places to find me.
Yeah, and you also find these references in the info box, guys, so you can always look it up there. So thank you again, Benabell, and thank you everybody for coming. So thank you again, Benabell.
For your time, Dr. Puka.
So thank you all so much for being here with our fantastic guest. I hope that you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, you know what to do. Smash the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Leave me a comment because I want to know what you thought about this conversation. I looked at the chat and it seemed like you guys were really enjoying the conversation, and there was a lot of love addressed to Benabell as well. So that's very nice to see. So don't forget to leave me a comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. I read a comment the other day about somebody saying that my video don't show up in their feeds. You hit the notification bell and you will always have a notification. And also don't forget to sign up to my newsletter because that's the best way to keep in touch with me, because you never know what's going to happen to social media. They can shut down at any moment, or I don't know, you get hacked or whatever. So it's not an audience that is my own. It's an audience that is on a specific social media. That's why I created my newsletter, to have my own tribe in my own place, which is my website. So please subscribe to the newsletter to get weekly updates and pictures and sometimes paper references or explanations about papers. So sign up. There's a lot of fun there. And thank you all so much for being here, and stay tuned for all the academic fun. Bye for now.